All right, folks, grab your seats and let's get started. Thank you for stepping aside from the busy affairs of the world to talk about my favorite subject, Lakewood sewers. Um, Soon to be your favorite subject. So tonight we have several objectives. First of all, this is a stakeholders meeting, which means it's a little different from a public meeting, although you are all members of the public. But each of you arrives tonight with some prior experience to engaging with the government, and you have or are contributing in a meaningful way to the governance of this city. And so we make the assumption that you're on the team to help us communicate what is a very complex message to our citizens. So there are several significant objectives tonight. One is for you to become informed on this subject so that you can share the information and also help engage from your standpoint. But we want you also to be a critical listener about how we present this tonight. There's a lot of information. It's fairly complex. So tonight is a bit of a dry run for future public meetings. So your input back to us now and in the future of how we can communicate this message is really important to us. So we also ask you to prepare yourselves actually to be facilitators at future public meetings. We anticipate, because of the nature of the subject, and you'll get to a sense of it, that the many aspects of this are best done in small group discussions. So we are planned 2 public meetings in December and in January that would be some form of large group presentation and then a large portion of small table conversation. We will be meeting at Lakewood High School in the cafeteria, which will have tables, and we'll be in a position then to turn around and ask a table to think about and absorb and maybe provide some feedback on some key questions. That'll be small groups. And naturally, given the subject, when that conversation happens, there'll be lots of questions. So one of our asks of you is to prepare yourselves to be at one of those tables to help that group work through some of the information that's available to us and provide feedback. And you will understand tonight how important that feedback is. And you'll also understand how the decisions ultimately will be made and who will make them. And unfortunately, we will not be voting on this question of what our sewers should look like. We will be selling what we think they should look like to folks who live far away from us in Washington, D.C. and Columbus. And they will ultimately be making the decision about what will ultimately happen. But also, each of you provides a frame of reference by virtue of your personal experience, your board or commission, your assignment, that allows us to maybe identify some creative aspects that will be ultimately important to our community. So we're going to build this foundation for discussion, and we are going to meet again as a small stakeholder group on November 15th to do 2 things. One, reaffirm some of the things you've learned tonight, will learn, but also that will be a work session. That will be actually a tabletop conversation in small groups. That meeting will be held at the Women's Pavilion in the round tables that are there, and it'll be a chance for you to begin to share a lot of your creative ideas in that small group setting. It will also allow us to practice and learn how we can do those small group conversations successfully. One of the key elements of our advocacy is to engage our community in a thoughtful manner, and what you will learn to be on a very complex subject. So tonight we're going to be talking about projects, engineering options, costs, and other criteria that you'll grow to understand. So I would like to introduce the administrative side of the team that's building this important plan. Mark Papke, is Mark here? No, he could not be here. Joe Benno, I know Joe is here, Director of Public Works, Civil Engineer. Jennifer Pay, Finance Director, is here. Kevin Butler, Law Director, I know Kevin is here in the back. Brian Shields, Project Manager, Civil Engineer, is here. Caitlin Milius, where's Caitlin? In the back, also a Civil Engineer, a Planner. Shannon Strachan, Executive Assistant to the Mayor. Shannon, I know, is in the back, and a lawyer. I'm Mike Summers, Mayor. I should have introduced myself there. Justin McCauley is also in charge of our government advocacy, which is our lobbying effort on behalf of the city to Washington and Columbus. We have with us an engineering consulting firm. Our lead firm. CT Consultants, Bob Greatek is on vacation, is not able to join us. Julia Lazar, where's Julia? Is here, a PhD. Mark Delicio, civil engineer, civil, right? And Craig Jude, where's Craig? Also a civil engineer. Craig, a lot of civil engineers here. We have a student civil engineer here tonight. We also have our legal advisor, Lou McMahon. Lou is here, and you're going to be hearing from Lou in a moment. And we have our financial analysis and also our structural advising firm, Raftelis. Joe Crea, where's Joe is here. And unable to join us tonight, but will be with us on the 15th is Melissa Elliott. And also Andy Lucas from Brown & Caldwell. Where's Andy? In the back. Brown & Caldwell is a national engineering consulting firm, has worked with cities like Lakewood all over the country. And they bring that national perspective that's important as we come down the stretch here to a major deadline of March 15th, March 1st, actually. So we're going to start the agenda by this introduction we've done. Lou McMahon's going to share the regulatory landscape. That's the EPA view of the world in the Clean Water Act, which is a federal law that defines really why we're here and what we're going to be undertaking. We're going to be hearing from Julia and Mark Delicio from CT Consultants about the actual engineering options that are emerging. Joe Crea is going to share the affordability considerations, and they are significant, and they, in many respects, will shape the reality of what's possible here. And then we'll wrap up. So one other thing that's important is, who are you? So we have city council members, I think two that I see, Tristan Rader and Sam. Anybody else walk in? Clean Water Lakewood Task Force, raise your hands if you were on the Citizens Advisory Group from 2 years ago. We have Lakewood Resiliency Task Force is here tonight with members. We have other city boards and commissions, Audit, CAC, BZA, ABR, Keep Lakewood Beautiful, Planning Commission, raise your hands. We have other city administration, Alex Harness, city planner is here. And who am I missing here? And we also have Rethink Advisors, Erwin Lowenstein. Erwin, I know I saw you. Erwin is a facilitator for the Resiliency Task Force. And we have Lakewood residents who at various times have been affiliated but are not. Raise your hands, Lakewood residents that are here. I know Dana, others. So we're glad you're here. So the point is, this is for information only. No quorum, I think, of any of our groups are here. We do not have a public meeting obligation, and we're not going to be making any decisions tonight. We're going to be gaining some knowledge. That's an important dimension. So I think, Lou, it's up to you to help us understand why we're here tonight and what people were thinking in 1972.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everyone. Oh, most people fall asleep after the lawyer talks. Can we try it again? Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Nice to see you. Help yourself to any more pizza, please eat. There's still some cookies left in that tray back there. This is informational and conversational to the degree we can to get through all this information. So if you have a question, we can entertain questions as we go along. Justin's got a microphone right there. We can take them at the end of each discussion. We can, at the very end of the evening, we'll be capturing questions too if they're more detailed. We want your feedback. We want your engagement. Okay, that's very important as you'll see to the process. It's very important to the plan. It is vitally important from my standpoint of negotiating with EPA. It's a central feature. So my name is Lou McMahon. I'm at a law firm called McMahon DeGullis. We're an environmental law firm with offices in Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. My day job is sewers. I represent communities all across Ohio. I've been representing Cincinnati Metropolitan Sewer District for 12 years in the implementation of its $3 billion consent decree program. For the last 5 years, I represented the sewer district and their $3 billion program. We represent communities large and small on consent decrees, on negotiating the consent decree, on trying to modify the consent decree, and trying to avoid the consent decree. So I'm here with a message of measured optimism because this realm is this arcane legal realm that we operate within. You have to deal with EPA. It ends up, you often have to deal with the court. If you're lucky, you can avoid dealing with EPA under a consent decree and just have your own plan. We'll talk about that. But one of the things that, again, is critical that I've measured optimism about is Lakewood's citizens and Lakewood's situation. What you coming out tonight is a big deal. We had the first round of the Clean Water Task Force a couple years ago, and there were some Ohio EPA people at one of the meetings, and they were blown away by what the task force was getting into, what the commitment of its citizenry, the knowledge base of its citizenry, and the willingness to look at solutions. And we've seen it time and again here in Lakewood over the years with the community vision meetings and other things. So you being here is important. You being very active tonight and on November 15th and going forward is very critical to the process. Okay, so now the boring stuff. Here's the framework of where it comes from. Clean Water Act. Just very simple, high-level overview. Clean Water Act, 1972. We can all take some credit for this, being Clevelanders, that the Cuyahoga River fire resulted in the Clean Water Act being born, which nationalized what states were doing on their own. And for our purposes tonight, one of the fundamental things is it came up with the National Pollution Elimination, Discharge Elimination System, NPDES permits, which basically said nationally it is against federal law to discharge a pollutant into navigable waters at the federal level or waters of the state at the state level unless you have a permit. And the idea was we're gonna control the end of the pipe and what goes into receiving waters, so that way we're gonna make our waters fishable and swimmable. 1972 goal. Okay, municipal discharges, anything that of sewage discharges or industrial discharges that came out of municipal sewers add pollutants or a discharge of pollutants into waters. Those became regulated in 1972 in a way that they had not been. They certainly had not been when Lakewood was built up. They had not been when most of Ohio was built up, all across the Great Lakes in particular. So certain discharges which had been, you're going to hear about it, especially from the mayor, were, I'll say, state-of-the-art, or state-of-the-art certainly in Northeast Ohio, and how sewers were built, being designed to overflow in high rain, discharge pollutants. Those became largely illegal, or at least subject to the Clean Water Act and NPDES permitting. So after the fact, long after the fact, after they had been built and operating, these remain now subject to Clean Water Act control. There are different kinds of discharges you're going to hear about. Telling the difference between them is a little bit of an art, and one of the things we'll be arguing about with EPA, but there is a combined sewer overflow. So part of this is you're going to hear lots of acronyms. Mostly they're developed by environmental lawyers to keep other lawyers from practicing in this area. Just keep them out. If we slip into acronyms, you can raise your hand and ask what those are because it just becomes part of the vocabulary. So what we're trying not to do, oh, very good. Andy's holding up. There actually is a glossary of acronyms and important terms that you should have and you should have with you because everybody who talks in this area slips into these. One of the main ones, what types of discharges are at issue here? We have combined sewer overflows. Okay, that's defined under the Clean Water Act and documents as overflows from a combined sewer, a single pipe that's a combined sewer that it is intended to carry both sanitary sewage and rainwater, stormwater. Okay, and then in high rains, when the volume's too much, it overflows and was designed to do so. A very efficient system, very prevalent across the eastern United States and other places. There's something called a sanitary sewer overflow, which is if you have a separated system, meaning two pipes, of one for sanitary sewer and one for the stormwater, any overflow from a sanitary sewer is a different category under the Clean Water Act. And those, EPA will say those are per se illegal. Overflow from a combined sewer overflow can get a permit, and as long as it's controlled to a certain level. We'll talk about how that's defined. But a sanitary sewer overflow is not supposed to happen at all, okay? What we have in Lakewood doesn't fit either of those. And it's frankly probably why we do not have a federal consent decree to this day, because EPA doesn't know what to tell us to do. As the mayor's going to show you, as you're going to hear tonight, as you're going to learn, we're not like anybody else. And somebody from Region 5 in Chicago told me, every city's unique. Every system is unique, but Lakewood is really unique. What Lakewood has, combined sewers, Lakewood has separated sanitary sewers, but we were built at the time when the state-of-the-art was two pipes in the same trench. over-under sewers, often connected by a manhole that allowed maintenance of the lower pipe going through the top pipe. And those are covered then with what's called an invert plate. You're going to hear a lot more about this, probably more than you ever want to know. Northeast Ohio has greater prevalence of over-under sewers than anywhere else in the country. So sewers that that flow into the sewer districts, sewers and their combined sewers that are part of the consent decree, some of those are over-under sewers. Cleveland Heights, which has its own consent decree, they have over-under sewers. They also have common trench sewers. These are very leaky to each other. In our case, they weren't even really designed to be separate all the time. They were actually designed to interact at high flows. They operate like a two-pipe combined system. There is no such definition under the Clean Water Act. So this is part of why we're different. We're very different. When we talk about those sewer systems, we also have to distinguish the stormwater system. This is where water, say, comes off catch basins on the streets, just through a pipe and is discharged to Rocky River or Lake Erie without intermingling generally with any sanitary sewer. But because of our very leaky sewer system, sometimes we get, you get some sewage into a stormwater outflow. It'll find its way as an overflow. Instead of going out a designed overflow, it'll go out a stormwater overflow. Those storm sewers are separately regulated under the Clean Water Act, under the stormwater program, which came later. All these together are what EPA looks at when we talk about discharges of pollutants. Okay, that's the very broad brush of the structure of what we have. Now, here's your homework. And you'll have these slides available to you. So if you really want to drill down into what the legal framework is for this, and you really have trouble sleeping at night, you can look at these documents. These are really the controlling documents for EPA in this discussion. The first was the 1994 National CSO policy that came out as a regulation from EPA, and the next year Congress basically elevated that into the statute of the Clean Water Act by saying all permits and approvals have to be consistent with the National CSO policy. Combined sewer overflow. Okay, good question. Go ahead and bring that in there. You're going to hear CSO now all the time. The CSO is a combined sewer overflow. So this policy focused on those single pipe systems that are prevalent in all our old cities, again, especially in Ohio. It was an idea of how do we come up with what can cities afford, how can they figure out what's the best level of control, how much control is enough if you can't keep all the stormwater out, because you can't, right? Mother Nature's always bigger and there's rains all the time and it's infrequent. If you can't keep it out, what should you do? If you look at that document, you'll see there's something called a presumptive approach, which in 1994 was the agreement, or the way to say if you get to a certain number of activations, limited number of activations, or a certain percentage of volume that goes out, we're going to say you're in compliance and you're meeting water quality standards. So if, for instance, if you had 4 or less overflows at a particular CSO in a year, we're going to say that's good enough. Now, there's some special cases in this policy, and we happen to be one of those too, because there are such things called sensitive areas. And the state of Ohio has declared all of Lake Erie a sensitive area for a couple decades. On that, under the policy of that, you're supposed to try to eliminate even combined sewer overflows if they go to a sensitive area. So it's a much higher level of scrutiny. Okay. There's something called a demonstration approach that's in there as well that really actually focuses on how many pollutants are you taking out. Okay, if you're discharging in a year, can you take out pollutants somewhere else? And you count sort of pollutants instead of just presuming that activations get you to compliance. This was coupled then with the 1997 financial guidance, which was the foundation for a whole bunch of the consent decrees that are out there that sort of measured how much cities could afford. It was not a very good document. It was very, there's no time value in there. It's not accurate. It takes a snapshot and projects for the next 15, 20, 30 years what a city supposedly could afford under these programs, and then became the scheduling mechanism. So this is why people have 15-year consent decree or 20-year program, or when the sewer district got 25 years to do their $3 billion program, they were one of the first in the country. These two guidance documents were there. They don't work very nimbly, and they didn't work really well in Lakewood. So as you'll hear, in 2006, the city of Lakewood submitted a very expensive and incomplete long-term control plan. It's much more expensive than the things we're talking about tonight, and it was incomplete. part of it was based on a misapplication of this 1997 guidance. So we've been talking to EPA for a number of years to get a better deal based on how to address our system and what we can actually afford. And we've been making progress all the way along. It's situations like ours and communities that have multi-billion-dollar consent decrees that led EPA in 2012 to come up with the integrated planning framework. And this is where there's some real opportunity for us. This was EPA recognizing communities can't afford to do all their stormwater plant improvements, collection system improvements all at once. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. This allows communities, the communities themselves, with public participation, to prioritize what is the biggest bang for their buck. What are you going to, if you're going to spend money, and we know there's limited money, what are you going to spend it on? In 2014, there was a new guidance document, financial guidance that came along with this too, that was much broader in scope and much more flexible in terms of how you figure out what a community can afford. And Joe's going to talk a little bit about that tonight. All these things are still active. All these make some of the art of dealing with EPA and how do you come out with an ultimate deal. But all of them have a very prominent place for public participation. And that's why you're here tonight. How does enforcement happen? I've mentioned consent decrees a few times. A consent decree is just it's basically a judicially enforced contract. A regulator goes to some regulated entity, like a city in a clean water context, or the city of Cleveland with the police has a consent decree, and says, okay, here's how you're going to come into compliance, and this is how you're going to operate, and this is the schedule of things you're going to do to come into compliance with some regulatory law. And it's judicially enforceable. If you do not meet your requirements, they can go into court, they can get stipulated penalties, they can force you to do it. It's all sort of done in court. So it's sort of a contract that's judicially enforceable. You can be held in contempt by the court if you do not meet your consent decree. It's a very onerous, non-nimble thing, and US EPA likes it a lot because it lets them sort of keep everybody on a national level, but it's very difficult. I spend a lot of my time now with people who have consent decrees trying to modify them because they found a better, cheaper, faster way to do it, and it's very difficult to do. Here's some examples, just if you want to take a look and look on their websites. The sewer district, again, I mentioned, had a $3 billion consent decree. We went through 3.5 years to get a minor modification on 5 little projects that were no-brainer, didn't change anything. They were better, cheaper, faster way, better for water quality, and it took 3.5 years to get approval through the U.S. government to modify their consent decree. Now, conversely, down in Cincinnati, because we had a good plan ahead of time, we were able to negotiate in the implementation plan a study and alternatives about how we could implement something. So in their case, if you can look on their website, you can read about the Lick Run project. It was originally a $500 million tunnel that was going to have to be built, and we thought there was a better way to get stormwater out at this overflow and achieve and spend money on the surface, redeveloping a neighborhood that hadn't seen any development in decades and decades. And it turns out the Lick Run project is a stormwater removal project that got combined sewer overflows down and saved $200 million. Okay, so there are better ways to do it, but you have to negotiate that flexibility in up front based on public input and opportunity, because it's really difficult to get on the backside after you've gone into a consent decree. These are some other ones locally that are around. Euclid has its own consent decree. Middletown is about the size of Lakewood. It just got one this year. Cleveland Heights is interesting because Cleveland Heights has its own consent decree for its collection system. So the good people of Cleveland Heights pay all the rates for the sewer district and its $3 billion consent decree, and those rates go up to fund the massive improvements that the sewer district's accomplishing. But US EPA came in and said your over, under, and leaky collection system needs its own consent decree, and you have to improve that by a certain time. Cleveland Heights does not have the ability to prioritize where the spending's going like we do, like we're going to be talking about here. Okay, so the route forward. This is critical. This is where the measured optimism comes in. We could choose to do nothing as a public. We could choose to just say EPA is going to tell us, but we're not going to like what they're going to tell us, right? They're going to take the most restrictive thing or the biggest projects and the fastest schedule that they think we can afford. If we come up with a plan through this process, if we get your input and make choices about what we can tolerate, what we like, what our priorities are, then we have the possibility of being able to push back on EPA. Public participation is very persuasive and can be, especially to EPA and especially to a federal judge, if we're standing in front of a federal judge at the end of this process, which is where it may go. So there's really no ability to not play this game, or else we're not going to like the result. There's no ability for the community to vote present, and we'd rather not choose. Our future, our route forward is to choose something that we can afford. And we should all know there's no non-local money to fund these programs unless you have an integrated plan where you can take other infrastructure dollars and marry them up to street projects and water projects, which is what we're talking about. If we can come up with that kind of integrated plan, then we have an opportunity to have something affordable. So this is what we're talking about. This is why I have optimism, because we have public input that most places don't, and it's very, very talented, active citizenry. So from specifically to the legal, if you want to look up things and educate yourself before November 15th or over this process, I encourage you to look at 3 places. You can look at the Lakewood Clean Water Lakewood website, and there's going to be lots of things on there. You should look at the US EPA wet weather website, wet weather page. It has links to CSO, all the acronyms are there. CSO, all the policies, it's all there. But I am also going to make myself available to every one of you, any one of you, who is totally confused by what I've just said, or anything that you've read, or anything that you're going to hear tonight. And you can email me or pick up the phone, and I would be glad to talk you through this. I do this all day long. I speak on this across the country at national conferences and otherwise. I am glad to teach and walk anybody through this. So my optimism comes from you being here, from Lakewood. We have a great story to tell. We've made progress over the last 10 years, even while we've been learning more about our system. The things we're talking about tonight are way cheaper than when I first got into this process, living in Lakewood, and I was part of the Citizens Infrastructure Committee. This is where we need to engage. This is now where the rubber hits the road. So I appreciate you being there. I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
So any quick questions for Lou at this point about the regulation? Clear as mud. All right.
Nick, you have a question? Great.
Sewer districts, was more negotiated just with the district and the EPA.
Correct. Actually, the district's consent decree was done in 2011, and there really wasn't a focus in integrated planning. And you have to remember with the sewer district, it's a regional entity. The sewer district owns 3 plants and all the combined sewers that are interceptors and none of the local sewers. And the integration really comes at the local collection system level. So the Lick Run project I gave you is a great example of integration because, and we were told that actually by EPA. EPA came to the ribbon cutting of when it started and said, you know, you folks in Cincinnati, you're a big reason that we have this policy because this is a better way to do it. That project, instead of building a big underground tunnel for, like I said, $500 million for about $280 million, they're building stormwater infrastructure on the surface, but they're also redoing roads in a major thoroughfare connection, so they're getting ODOT dollars and other dollars. They're getting brownfields dollars to clean up a foundry that's been closed for 30 years. They've taken down some houses that, let's just say it was a historic buying opportunity in 2012 when they started buying those, that we're not going to see investment. And it's a chance to reinvent on the surface, to spend the very limited dollars that Cincinnati has on the surface instead of just bigger pipes in the ground. Now, there's a lot of factors there, the location, the geography, the topography, and all those issues. But Cincinnati was able to pull those all together, looking at those questions, to get the result that they wanted. Lakewood is exactly the same positioned for that. The integrated plans aren't approved by EPA, but they're supposed to be a framework for a foundation for compliance going forward. It actually says in the document, instead of a consent decree, you might just have your integrated plan and then be able to implement it in your 5-year permit renewals for your NPDES permit, which allows the flexibility to take advantage of new opportunities if they come, instead of being locked into a 20, 25-year capital program that's really difficult to change. So It's a long way around. That is an example I would point you to, because EPA has given that example of that project. Anyone else? All right, you have my email, you have my phone number, you have my strong encouragement to call me, because sewers are my practice, so I'm glad to talk to you anytime you like. Thanks.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about our uniqueness. But let me just tell you, one of the creative opportunities from my standpoint is we have resiliency folks here. We have folks dealing with our CBG block grant allocations, harmonizing of folks with old houses, low-income houses, with a great opportunity for harnessing technology of the future. The perfect solution is the idea that we would have a waste treatment facility at the household level that would capture this stuff, treat it, convert it to energy to be used at the household level, and eliminate any need for having to worry about dirty water downstream. So Corrigan, I want you to invent that toilet. But actually, we've learned that Bill Gates has a $24 million Toilet of the Future match grant. So there is some thinking out there that says, wait a minute, we're doing all this work the same way we've done it for 100 years. What can we do differently to kill several birds with one stone? So that's part of the creative aspect of it. And this is a perfect example of an external threat that the Resiliency Task Force is addressing, where you have a federal regulation that's making us change the way we think and behave. And the question is how we can bend that to the advantage of us all. But we have to do it. Anybody been to the new visitor center at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. since underneath the parking lot? So if you were to go down there, they have a series of displays. And in the displays, if they haven't changed it, is all the work papers to develop the Clean Water Act of 1972. And there you would learn how they mocked up the bill. You see it all there. And you would also learn that Richard Nixon vetoed the bill. And he vetoed the bill because at that moment in time, it was estimated it would cost $750 billion for the nation to comply with that act. Congress overrode him, and the act became law. Today, that's probably several $1 trillion of cost to implement it. So the issues haven't changed much. So I want to emphasize the idea of how unique we are. A couple key points for you to grab. It was not built as one system. It's an amalgamation of many subsystems built over many years. It was all built in a pre-World War II environment, so the technology was older. And the theory of environmentalism was that the solution to pollution was dilution. And the pollution source was from our homes. The dilution source was Lake Erie. So public health was the primary objective: diphtheria, cholera, typhoid. And anything they could do to move that water away from the population was a good day's work. And so you'll have the system, plus you know that Lakewood is actually on a hill. Lakewood Heights is about 55 feet higher than Edgewater Drive. They understood the geology of Lakewood and the opportunity to leverage gravity as a friend here, and they built a terrific system. And that system performs as designed. From the day it was built, started to be built, until now, it performs fabulously. The problem is it's illegal. So in 1900, this is what Lakewood sewer system looked like. You see Birdtown, and they began to put some sewers and direct it to the lake, down 117th into the lake. And you see another little piece of sewer. I can't even read the street there. But primarily, there wasn't much going on in Lakewood, although it was about to change in a very rapid way. So in 1900, they began to realize we need to direct this stuff somewhere, and they began to design what is now our waste treatment facility. It was basically a settling pond. Remember that gravity piece. The question is, how could you get it from high up on the cliffs of Lakewood, all throughout Lakewood, down to this settling pond on the banks of the Rocky River in what is now the Metro Parks. But all that started in 1900. So by 1910, Lakewood was booming, and you began to see some further extensions of this collection system. Again, notice they all go north to the lake and discharge into the lake. It was obviously using gravity. It did its public health job. It got the bad water away from the population. So by 1920, 1912, I wanted to show this piece. There was a pipe at the end. Actually, I'll go back up. There's a pipe at the end of Riverside. I can't put my finger on it, but Where that red square is, if you go a little diagonally up and to the right, is Riverside. And that pipe actually captured water, and that pipe then ran downhill, and where it's yellow at the bottom is the Rocky River. So basically, they were able to systematically get a fair amount of water to the Riverside of Madison intersection, and they built this long sloping pipe that dumped it right into the Rocky River untreated. That was 1912. So we look at Brown Road. This is an example. You're going to get a keen sense of this in multiple ways. In 1915, over and under sewer, common trench. You see a diagram there. And that Brown Road sewer would have run north to Madison Avenue, likely down Madison Avenue to that Riverside, and dumped into the Rocky River untreated. By 1920, you can begin to see how things begin to change. And that red line shows the first extension of our major interceptor. That's a larger pipe that begins to capture and connect what historically were a bunch of pipes that went to the lake. They tried to redirect it now further west and get it to that plant that was substantially built. And so it started from the plant and basically worked its way up West Clifton. And the colors on this chart represent the tributaries of how water moved through the system. So the green would follow green all the way up through pipes ultimately to the lake from in the middle, and purple likewise. So you get the idea that even in the picture of the streetcar and the sewer interceptor, it was a lot of digging. It was very difficult to do. By 1930, you see the extension of the interceptor. That interceptor is very important. So they took this major pipe. What is it, Joe, about 7 feet, the interceptor in diameter? It's actually elliptical.
No, it's smaller. The interceptor's really about 48.
So 48 inches to 60 inches. And you see it begin to move across Lakewood to the east, trying to capture those pipes as they came down from the other interceptors. If we were to build that today, it would not be 48 inches. It would be probably 6 feet or maybe 10 feet or 12 feet. And that's one of the problems we have, is because we're piecemealing the system, it wasn't designed to collect the volume that ultimately came its way. And that's what we're having to redo. This is an example of Forest Cliff. Now, many little streets from Lake Avenue to the north had their own little system. And highlighted in yellow here is a filter bed. So if you lived in 1933 on Forest Cliff, you basically sent your stuff to this filter bed at the cliff's edge, and they tried to filter out best they could, and it went into the lake, untreated. And so you had these little subsystems all around Lakewood, doing their own thing, achieving the objective of protecting population health, using gravity to get it away, but basically using our lake as our dilution source. So by 1940, you see a much more evolved system. The interceptor is beginning to extend as well. And then by 1945, you see the final link to the interceptor all the way to 117th. So what happens today in a big storm is a drop of water, let's say a cup of water, that falls in Birdtown, by and large, may not ever have a chance of getting to our plant because all the water to the west of it that's moving north and west. So the whole system begins to fill up pretty rapidly, and so a drop of water on the eastern end has no chance. The system is full. It's already discharging into the lake to the west, and that water in the eastern end of Lakewood has no choice but to head out to discharge points, generally along Nicholson and some parts along 117th Street, untreated. And Jim and I live on Wilbert, and our street has its own design issues, but they were built that way. So you get the idea that we now are forced to collect water every day. Dry water, by the way, no problem. We collect up to 10 times the volume. We have the capacity to collect up to 10 times our dry weather volume, our everyday volume, like today. Dry weather day, no problem. Plenty of capacity in this system. Our challenge is these big water events, and we know that they're happening more frequently. In fact, I just learned that there have been 27 500-year storms in the last 20 years. I think that's the right parameter. 27 storms nationwide, well, probably across the world, I think. 500-year events. Now, 500-year event storm is a storm that only happens once every 5 years. 500 years, that's how big it is. And we've had 27 of these in the last 20 years across the world. So the idea of Mother Nature and her ferocity rearing its head, putting more volume into a system that's not designed to handle it anyway, under the best of conditions, when we have big rainstorms, and then we complicated that. So you get the idea that today, the engineering to fix all this requires us to take a system that was not built as a system and figure out how we can take every drop of water that hits Lakewood under any condition, dry weather, wet weather, collect it, and then handle it responsibly. That's the challenge that the Clean Water Act gives to us. And you can get some sense of how we are, how we deal with that. Now I show this as an example. This is the discharge set of pipes today at Madison and Riverside. So remember that simple pipe that showed up in about 1915? Well, this is what happens when you try and create a system that was not built as a system. I mean, it probably, you would flunk a civil engineering exam if you said this is a perfect example of how we design a sewer system. But the fact of the matter is you have stuff coming from so many directions and so many different environments. You see this very complex connection to try and get stuff to the right place under the right circumstances. And so everything's pretty compromised, and this is a good example of that. This particular intersection is one you're going to hear more about because it's a fairly large volume and it probably has some significant engineering options that we want to grow to understand. So in the end, we have available to us a very narrow set of choices. We can prevent stormwater from going into our system. And that's a function of basically diverting water into the ground the best that we're able. We can minimize its impact through bioretention cells, which we have all over the place, more green space. We can transport and store it somewhere else. You see these big infrastructure tunnels being built. On I-90 in Bracknell, they just completed, I think, about a 6-mile tunnel. I think it's 23 feet in diameter, or 43. It's a very large tunnel, and it is basically a big storage tank. It's called the Euclid Creek Tunnel. I think it's about $300 million just for that tunnel. It has a very complex set of pumps because it diverts water that normally would go into Lake Erie into this tunnel while the storm is happening. The storm goes through, and then they have to pump all this water out gradually and treat it in the normal dry weather occurrence. That's fine if you have plenty of time between the first storm and the second storm. But if there happens to be a second storm that comes along before you finish draining that tank, you got a big problem. You're actually discharging again. And the EPA has no sense of humor about these storage tricks. So they're very expensive. They're sized to do certain work. And they make certain assumptions about what happens typically across a year, but that may not be what actually happens. So it's a very complicated world. And then ultimately, we prevent it from going into the system. We minimize the volume that goes into our system. We transport it and store it somewhere, but ultimately we treat it. And the question is, what does that treatment look like and how big is that treatment facility? So in Lakewood's case, we're challenged to get all our volume to the treatment plant because of all the restrictions in pipes and connections. And then we have the capacity of the plant itself. And we're going to begin to hear how we're going to deal with a lot of these issues. So starting in roughly 2006, CT consultants have been extensively mapping and metering, measuring, and modeling our sewer system. They have a very complex computer model that allows us to simulate behavior in different conditions in certain parts of the city. And that allows us to figure out which engineering solutions might work, what the impact would that be by plan or by unintended consequences upstream. Do we create further problems? Hydraulics, you'll learn, are a key point, which is the actual force of the water moving through the system and the speed creates its own performance issues. All that is a function of understanding what it is we're doing. And the EPA basically said in 2006, you need to understand your system, and that we've done, and we're really able to measure that. We've also launched the pilot study in the middle part of Lakewood, just south of Harding Middle School. And that was a pilot study to determine how we can effectively separate storm from sanitary at the household level. That's the source control piece you're going to grow to understand. So if we could effectively separate at the household level and keep it separated as it moves through the plant, that changes the nature of what the system can do. You're actually allowed to discharge rainwater into a watershed. But once that rainwater is not rainwater, it's mixed, then it's a whole different conversation. So this deals with the question of, can we separate it successfully at the household level and keep it separated through the system, and therefore have different options as we collect it. We're at about 2.5 years in, field investigations, confirmation of cross connections at the household level. We've had public meetings, the cost of it. We have all kinds of complicated issues that help us understand how we can be successful at the household level or not. We actually believe there's about 7,500 houses in Lakewood that needs serious work at the household level. And so we want to understand what the engineering of that would be, what the cost would be, and how we would manage such a job. And the pilot study is part of that, and that'll be baked into our ultimate recommendations. You see examples of green infrastructure. That's another term you'll become familiar with, and that's where we divert the water into the ground. You see examples of Madison Park in this case, also in the parking lots behind Geiger's and First Federal. Those are designed to use permeable surfaces to capture water and get it into the ground. Those little brick pavers that are there are actually spaced, and the kind of material that's underneath them allow water to percolate through and get into the ground instead of going into the sewer system. There's also some bioretention devices at the lower ends of each of those parks or parking lots. So McDonald's, every example of a commercial redevelopment we have in Lakewood now features green infrastructure. So you see example in the back of McDonald's is a bioswale, and it's designed to capture all the water coming off that roof and the concrete surfaces there. You'll see those examples all over Lakewood now. In fact, at the new Family Health Center, in that parking lot, you'll see permeable surfaces. That's what that's one of the primary features there. So the fact of the matter is, as we start each day in 2018, we collect and treat about 10 times our average daily dry weather volume. Dry weather is an important concept. That means we don't have any rain trying to infiltrate the system. That's just our normal stuff. We turn on our tap water, we run our washing machines, we flush toilets. We basically are bringing that water into our houses, we're using it, and we're discharging it into our system, our sewer system. That's dry weather flow. And we have the capacity to treat 10 times that volume. So we can have little storms all the time. We do, no problem. Our system can flex, and it does. So today, we treat 85% of every drop of water that hits Lakewood in any condition. We've approved a project. City Council just passed approval of a new it's an addition to our treatment capacity that will improve our volumes of collection and treatment to 88%. And that's a high-rate treatment, and that will be online in roughly 2022, I think. Fact is, we've spent $60 million in the past 10 years alone that have moved the needle from 79% to 85%, ultimately to 88%. And you've got the items listed there. We've expanded the treatment system. We've expanded the collection system. We've got the source control system that's helping us in measurable ways. And we're about to add this $23 million high-rate treatment. Bids just went out. Bids came in slightly a little less than we'd forecasted. That's good news. The engineering has been built, and now we'll begin the expansion of that, and it'll take us a couple years to build this. So somewhere around early 2022, that comes online, and that will divert a sufficient volume that will move us to the 88%. As Lou has helped us understand, there are many, many cities across the country that are under consent decrees with a goal to get them to 88%. So part of our story, and you're going to help us tell this story, is the fact that we have worked hard to get to where we are. We've made good faith investments along the way. We've had effective investments. We have more to do. We accept that responsibility of being good stewards to our watershed. We need lots of time to make these because of the burdens of cost, and we need flexibility, as Lou pointed out. And whatever regulatory restrictions they put on us, they must respect our affordability, and they must respect our need for creativity. And that's part of the mantra that we're going to be pounding away at. And while we're prepared to identify that we understand how to manage this system with new improvements, but it's a challenge to us. In addition to our sewers, we've also, over the last 12 years, made $19.5 million worth of drinking water improvements. I was at a Clean Water, a mayor's council meeting of the U.S. Council of Mayors in Flint, Michigan, a week and a half ago. And I will, as you might imagine, Flint thinks a lot about drinking water, as well they should. And it's a very complicated, perfect storm of mistakes and circumstances. But what I also learned was a lot of cities in Michigan are worried about drinking water. I also learned that Indianapolis is very worried about drinking water, and that we take for granted that we don't worry about drinking water here. We have plenty of it. It's well treated. It's well managed. Our obligation in Lakewood is to make sure it's well distributed. And we run our own water system here, which means we buy water. It's metered into the city. We buy it wholesale, sell it to you, our consumers at retail, and the difference then funds the distribution system, which is about 120 miles of water mains. And then there are all the private water lines coming from the water main to your house. And so maintaining the cleanliness of that water, the pressure of that water for a variety of reasons, convenience and fire safety, and also maintaining the integrity that we don't lose water through leakage because there's a natural loss of that water. But the point is, when we think about water, we're here primarily talking about sewers, but there's another whole big conversation out there about drinking water. The good news is we really have that pretty well identified and addressed because we're in a very good regional water system, and we are making responsible investments in our own portion of that. So just a quick recap. So 2002, we began in earnest to plan what the future is in the Clean Water Act requirements. 2006, a plan was developed, as Lou pointed out. It was incomplete ultimately, and the EPA, both federal and state, said, you've got a lot of work ahead of you. You need to do a better job of studying your system, and we've done that. 2011-14, we've developed this model that I talked about. It's very complicated. Mark D'Alessio runs that model and does a great job of it, but it's a great planning tool and allows us to affirm the integrity of the decisions we make. In 2014, this was an important benchmark. We received a new 5-year permit that expires next September 2019. That permit specified that instead of a consent decree, we would make responsible investments, including the design and begin the construction of this new high-rate treatment facility, which we've done. And that bought us the flexibility of the 5 years. From 2017 and 18, we've been refining the plans and options, and tonight is really our first opportunity to present what is ultimately a comprehensive plan of what we think we need to do to comply. So in 2019, March 1st, we will submit a recommended, well, it's not even a recommended, it's basically a proposed plan that we think identifies it, which will begin a significant amount of conversation and ultimate negotiations. And that's where you come in as well. So your job is to help us shape what we submit on March 1st, and then your job also, and others in the community, is to maintain part of this negotiation. We'll be sharing information about what we're hearing, the results of decisions that are being made. You'll give us feedback as to how we can best represent the interests of this city. And then in 2022, we'll celebrate the expansion of, or the increase of the high-rate treatment. So we've got a lot of work. The fact of the matter is, as you will quickly learn, we can't afford at this moment in time to take on any other big projects because we've already taken on a new $23 million one, this high-rate treatment facility. And it's a good one, but there are many other projects that you will grow to understand in a moment that are looming, and how we factor that into our plan is a big part of the challenge. So I'm going to turn the podium over to our engineers and scientists, Julia and Mark from CT, and they're going to share the engineering options, costs, and factors to be considered. Jim?
What percentage of properties do you think have commingled sewer and sanitary on their properties before it ever gets into the city?
That's a great question. So in Lakewood, my house built in 1918, pretty hard to trench. It's built on shale, as is yours. Many houses put one pipe from the system, from the house, so they combine it at the house, which is what Jim's pointing out. The other element that's part of that, though, however, is in a common trench, where your sanitary is at the lowest level, your storm's above it. Over 100 years, my house is 100 years old, there's an enormous amount of leakage between my storm pipe, or could be, and storm pipe and the sanitary pipe below it. So even if there are two pipes, you can get what they call is, and you'll learn the term I&I, it's about infiltration of stormwater into the sanitary from a leaky system. So part of our pilot study was to understand the implications of how you take an old system and make it not leak, so that even if it's designed properly, you don't have infiltration. But what else happened was, house construction, 1918, pretty unregulated business, contractor's doing his job, nobody's looking around, he digs the trench to the street, he finds a pipe in the street, he hooks it up to the pipe, he doesn't care, nor does anybody else whether it's the right pipe. There might not have been two pipes in the street, public side. There might have been two pipes. But it's pretty hard to trench in that shale. He comes to the first one, happens to be the storm, hooks the sanitary pipe into the storm, bingo, we're combining. So that's all part of it. So when the answer is, we believe 7,500 houses have some type of work, of some combination of all the factors I just mentioned. I think you're going to get a sense of that in a minute. That's ahead of us, if we were to deal with the source control as the exclusive remedy. We think there's many aspects, and you'll get a sense of this. But does that answer your question? 7,500?
The homeowner's responsibility.
Yep, it is the homeowner's responsibility, and that's another interesting conversation. There's an equity question, there's an affordability question at the homeowner on the homeowner side, not to mention the public side. So we've got a lot of challenges here. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Mark and Julia.
All right, I think first, just to acknowledge this process to this date and compliment the mayor and the city staff and administration and everybody in this room. As the engineers and CT and Brown and Caldwell, we go through these projects, and not for all of them are there rooms like this. So Mayor was talking about firepower before, and this is going to be extremely important moving forward. So getting your buy-in and helping others get educated who aren't in this room is going to be important in the coming months. I'm going to try to keep this at a high level. Obviously, with the engineering behind it, it can get very detailed, especially with the complex model. And we're going to work through that detail, I think, more so in the November 15th meeting. But right now, we want to kind of talk about some concepts and just the overall process to this point. So as Mayor's mentioned, more must be done. And we've collected a lot of data over the past 2+ years. And we're at a point now where we're using the model that we've developed. We continue to refine it, but we're starting to be able to look at things and prioritize things, prioritize different sewer sheds, and start to look at different alternatives. So some of the maps I'm going to show you here are just examples of that. As they continue to change, they kind of give, I think, everybody in this room a sense of where we're headed. This first map is explaining overflow volume by sewer shed. Those with red values have higher overflow volumes. Those with green values have lesser overflow volumes. This just gives us an idea of, volumetrically, where are we losing flows at from this system. There's a complex network of pipes, behind that, but those are really the sewer sheds that we've identified within the city. This next slide is important, and this is speaking really to the volume, the poundage of pollutants, the pollutant loading, in which sheds are contributing pollutants the worst from sewage. So that allows us to identify which parts of the system might be acting a little bit worse. And it doesn't mean that the houses on private property are worse in that area. It's a total picture of the way the systems were built and how they interact with each other. Just to follow up with this one, there's identifiers on each of those sewer sheds, and you'll see that in a following slide, but we've generally tried to come up with alternatives and costs for those alternatives, and we relate them back in most cases to those identifiers that you're seeing up there. Next step is going to be, as Mayor said, a plan due in March, and up here on the slide are some of the things that are going to be included in that plan. an evaluation of cost and effectiveness for all these different alternatives we're looking at. And with Brown and Caldwell, we continue to add alternatives to that list and come up with ways to save money and more efficient means and mechanisms. We've developed alternatives over the past, I want to say 2 years. In 2016, we actually submitted a Phase 1 report that we'll get into in a minute here. In this 2019 report, we're also going to develop an implementation schedule and understand if we do projects A, B, and C, when can we do them? How quickly can we do them? How quickly can we do them in conjunction with the cost of them? How quickly can the city pay for them? And then that gets into the affordability analysis that will also be a part of that 2019 report, which Joe is going to be talking about here shortly. And within that are the financial capability assessment and also a sewer rate study. So after in 2016, we met with Clean Water Lakewood task working groups, and we sat down and started identifying potential alternatives. And in that phase, years ago, we started to gather public input and get an understanding for the flavor of the types of alternatives that the city might be interested in. We took those recommendations and we modeled them with the data we've collected and the model that we've built, and tried to estimate and understand how effective they would be. And we reported that back to those working groups. So that was a kind of a key point in Phase 1 of this integrated wet weather improvement program that the city's undertaken. So we want to carry all those concepts forward, and we have. And we've tried to refine upon them as well. In this phase, in Phase 2, where we're at now, we've put a little bit more time into the ranking of those alternatives. We've got a bunch of alternatives now in our toolbox, and now it's time to start maybe picking the tools out and putting the pieces of the puzzle together and understanding what the cost implications are, and all these other implications. So just to list through them quickly: inconvenience to the public. Are streets being torn up, and is that the nuisance? Is it disrupting traffic? Is it near private property that people's driveways are torn up and they can't access their driveway? What's the how much can the public tolerate, really, is that one. Reasonable price compared to other alternatives. This is really comparing one alternative against the other and just seeing how much bang for the buck you're getting in terms of removing the pollutant loading from, instead of going to the atmosphere, being able to treat it in some capacity, or never let the stormwater get in from the beginning. Useful life. This is how long we anticipate the proposed infrastructure to last for. Typical sewer project can last from 50 up to 100 years for that infrastructure. We see it lasting sometimes in advance of 100 years on rare occasions. But these projects all have different useful lives. Does not increase the risk of basement flooding. As we step through this process, we want to be very cognizant that we're not causing adverse impacts up system, and we want to take advantage of the city spending money to resolve any issues that are currently occurring. So that's a factor. Integration with other projects. This is an integrated plan, so we want to be able to couple our spending dollars when a roadway is being torn up because there's resurfacing going through. Let's put the sewer in then. So we want to match our projects up, sewer projects with other projects. So how well does it rank in those terms? And then a willingness to invest in the administrative and maintenance duties that come along with all these. We know we need to select some alternatives. We do want to consider what the burden is going to be, though, on the city down the road. How much are we going to have to maintain these things? What's the workforce going to look like that will have to maintain these things? How much burden is put on the homeowner as well in terms of maintenance? So we try to make it numerical in some sense, but at a high level, that's what we want you to start thinking about as well, and help us and give us feedback so that, if we've done this internally and came up with a ranking and the public sees it completely differently, we need to know that and incorporate that into the plan. Okay, technologies used to solve overflow problems. We'll get into these in more detail, but green infrastructure, gray infrastructure, and source control. Green infrastructure is reverting back to the natural processes that were in place before things got developed and we put all this concrete in. We want things to slow down. We want the water to infiltrate and really never get to the system. Gray infrastructure is what you see. Mayor had some pictures up earlier. Tunnels, treatment facilities, new larger sewers to store, convey, and treat the wastewater, the stormwater, which potentially is contaminated depending on where you're at in the city. Source control, this was what Mayor had also started getting into about resolving the leakiness that comes with the age of these systems and preventing stormwater from getting into the sanitary sewer, which should not be doing anyway. All right, so this is a slide that is preliminary in nature, but it shows some of the work that's been done to date. In the left-hand column are the overflow sewer sheds that you saw in the previous maps. You'll see them again on the next one. But this is a matrix that identifies what some potential pieces of the puzzle may be. And if you look at the second column, it's approximate outfall location. We don't want you to think that's the only location that these technologies would be employed at. It's really, that's the point where the outfall is. So it's a larger sewer shed contributing to that point that these technologies would be employed throughout. So just to go through some of them and get your mind, set forth on the November 15th meeting. Storage tunnels or storage facilities. Source control, we talked about, fixing the leakiness. Sewer separation, when you have a combined sewer, you have the option to put in a new separate storm or new separate sanitary pipe in addition to that one. So then, essentially, in that sense, you have a two-pipe system, both with dedicated uses, one for sanitary, one for storm. Relief sewers are just put in place to transport the flow that right now the system otherwise can't handle down to either a storage facility or the treatment facility. Regulator updates, these are typically smaller modifications made to the existing system where flows go in a certain way because of a weir. Maybe we can improve that weir and keep the flow in the system. HRT is high rate treatment. One of those is being built. Diversion sewers, redirect the flow maybe over to a different sewer shed if the sewer shed they're contributing to right now is overwhelmed. Aerial sewer, you've already got some of these down near the plant, but it would essentially allow us to get more flow to the plant and to an area where we can treat it. And then additional pump stations. So the cost column is, again, preliminary in nature, and it doesn't include some of the red X's you see up there. Those are a little bit fresher alternatives that we're still working through the details of and the feasibility of. But you can see all of these things add up. If we were to piece them all together and say, this is what we think our plan is, you can see the order of magnitude down there, approximately $300 million. And we're not saying this is the plan. We're saying here's some pieces that we've identified. We haven't put the pieces together yet, but here's some ideas. So, and those costs also are, assuming a 100-year life cycle. And in the case of green infrastructure, for example, when you put those features in, they have a lesser useful life than some of the gray infrastructure. So when we plan out over 100 years, are you having to replace that facility at the 50-year mark? Those costs are all incorporated into this 100-year life cycle cost. So we're going to work to refine those, but we also want to get input from you so that we make sure we're going in the right direction. I'm going to turn it over to Julia now.
Hi, all. Good to see some Clean Water Lakewood folks from a few years back. So yeah, my background is in science, environmental science, and I'm also working on helping Lakewood to comply with all of their Clean Water Act missions. But so first, one of the common things that you'll see here is a lot of source control check marks in those boxes. So we're going to talk about the source control pilot study. And here, you can just see this table is relevant to the outfall IDs that are also listed per sewer shed in this map and also on that map. So in the November meeting, you guys will be working in small groups, kind of talking about alternatives within these sewer sheds in more detail. But talking about source control, private property work may be part of the solution. So source control is really about how do you not have sanitary sewage mixing with stormwater on private property and going into the right-of-way on the main, in the streets. So this is a picture of a manhole separation on the right-of-way, and this was either on Atkins, but so there was 103 homes that were worked on, and someone here was in that pilot study too, so that's helpful. But so the main goal is to reduce the rainwater from entering the sanitary sewer. The reason being is that we don't want to have stormwater entering the sanitary sewer. Then when the sanitary sewer is at capacity, then there's an overflow. Those overflows are what's not legal versus stormwater, which is totally fine. So we don't want to have it mixing. This is a picture of a home and the work being done on the lateral in the front of the house, as you can see. So there was the first phase where we did a lot of work and we learned that the pipes are often clogged and cracked. So some of that you can get rid of by flushing it out, and we also relined the sanitary laterals. But we learned that even if you don't, that there was still leakiness between the storm and the sanitary laterals. We also learned that water from the rooftops often ended up in the sanitary sewers. So for example, this shows in the blue all of the storm water from the roof going down and then around the perimeter of the house in the storm drain that goes down to the lateral. But we also see that basically those pipes are old and leaking, and they leak into the sanitary lateral underneath. So we had lined in phase one the first part of the lateral from the right-of-way down to the house, but not underneath the house. And there were still plenty of areas where stormwater can get in underneath the house and start draining. Yes?
What material are these pipes made from?
So there's a variety. Most homes are, older, and so their clay pipes are common. There's some iron pipes. Newer ones are PVC pipes. So yes, Brian knows a lot. Brian's the project manager on source control. So yeah, mostly clay pipes. And most of the time, this is not something that, unless you're having a flooding problem, you're not fixing and replacing. So it's easy to have cracked pipe and not know it. So what we learned is that you really, for phase two, what we're getting at is replacing the pipe, the pipe that has all of the stormwater coming off of the roofs and going around the perimeter of the homes, replacing that pipe and making sure that that's not leaking down into the sanitary lateral. So we cleaned the laterals, we relined them where needed, we're replacing along the perimeter to make sure the stormwater from the roof is not getting into a leaky pipe, and then we're making sure the driveways are also connecting to the storm sewer, and if needed, a sump pump to be installed. This was less common than expected, and there was only a few sump pumps installed in that pilot study, maybe 3 or 4, so it was less than anticipated. So the goal of this study is to try and understand, one, is it effective? Are we reducing flows enough to actually reduce the combined sewer overflows coming out of Lakewood? The first phase showed around a 30% reduction. We were looking for a lot more. That's why we did a second phase, trying to remedy all of the leakiness that we saw after doing some further dye testing after phase one. So if this shows success and it is useful and we're able to get to a much larger percentage of stormwater not interacting with sanitary water, then does the public even want to go down this? What are their interests and what do they perceive as too inconvenient, or is this better and more sustainable than other larger pipe infrastructure projects? And also, we're just trying to learn what works best. We learned a lot from phase one going into phase two about all the efforts you need to do on private property and investigations that need to be done to make sure, like we're saying, perhaps you don't even need to worry so much about the sanitary line and more just focus on your work on the stormwater line. And also learning more about the pricing. Is this the least expensive way to solve the problem? And if it is the least expensive way, does that make some of the inconvenience of it more palatable? So as you can see, your engagement is key on this issue because it will affect a lot of us. So November 15th, there's going to be a meeting, and that will be more small group work sessions. And then there's also December 4th and January 16th meeting. And right now, Joe will be talking about moving on towards affordability. Oh, yes, sorry. Go for it. Yes.
You said there was a 30% reduction. You said there's a 30% reduction from phase 1. Do you have data on phase 2 yet?
No, because the construction's not complete.
Okay.
So once that's complete, the flow meters will go in, and then we'll be able to give you more data. Yes.
On the stormwater side, how many different watersheds are in the city of Lakewood? I assume there's at least 2, maybe more. And I guess the real question is there any stormwater burden from outside of Lakewood that comes into Lakewood?
So we're really, in a natural environment, we really are just in the Lake Erie watershed, just draining to the Lake Erie. But sewer sheds, which are, man-made
Yeah, I get
watersheds, there's plenty of those. So that kind of map, like here, like just to your right, you'll see the map of the colorations. That would be all of the sewer sheds. So there's probably 15 or more that you can see. So those are all the sewer sheds, and we certainly do have water coming from outside influences in some ways, mostly underground. So all the stormwater that maybe comes from places south or west of us, or east of us, I mean, everything west kind of just goes into the river anyway, but those might fill up the pipes that we also use. So sometimes there's sharing of pipes between communities that would maybe be filled with somebody else's stormwater before we're able to fill them. And that's sort of like what we were talking about for when it rains. If the interceptor is already full, like the mayor was mentioning, then there's, no hope for our stormwater to go anywhere.
I guess I would just add to that, there are connections with our system between City of Lakewood and the regional sewer district. And we have our eye on those, and we're in addition to the alternatives that were in that list, talking and thinking about alternatives to deal with those interconnections and what's the best way, both financially and feasibly, to deal with those interconnections. But in general, it's not like there's a pipe every other street coming from the south coming into our man-made sewer sheds. That's generally not the case. The point of connection between the two systems, we have a good understanding of that, and it's not a major driver in our development of alternatives.
Yeah, it's mostly just our stormwater in the majority of for our issues. It's not coming from another town.
As a good neighbor, we allow Rocky River to send some of its stuff to us. We shouldn't let Rocky River forget that, should we?
Any other questions on that part?
While Joe's coming up, I'll just add a historical point. The wastewater treatment plant that Lakewood has actually for some time provided service to part of West Park. When the sewer district came through, when it was created, it created a west side interceptor. So both the construction of I-90 and the west side interceptor really captures a lot of what's south of Lakewood from coming in. As Mark said, it's on 117th where there's some interaction, but it's not like things are flowing across I-90 into Lakewood.
Are we going to be able to shut that valve off at the north end of 117th and divert it?
So the question, as you'll learn in great detail, I'm sure, on November 15th, is specific to one of the overflows, the interconnections between, on 117th, the mayor showed Madison and Riverside and looked like spaghetti. 117th is its own creature, well beyond that. And so there are some interconnections there. In dry weather, flow comes to us. In wet weather, some goes towards the sewer district. The question is, those are among options to look at, and we've evaluated some of those. Certainly, any change to that circumstance is not in our own doing. It would require agreement of both the city of Cleveland which considers the matter complete, and the sewer district. So as we look at options, we also have to look at what we're able to do and not what requires others to join in.
Great. Yeah, my name's Joe Cree. I work for a company called Reftelis. We work throughout the state of Ohio with water and sewer utilities in helping them prepare for and plan, some of these big financial challenges that we're going to talk about and that we have talked about and I know you all are familiar with. We work with municipalities across the country that are implementing these billion-dollar consent decree programs, so we're very familiar with this problem and we're happy to be a part of the team. Before we get into some of the specific information, a little bit of background information about the water and sewer utilities here in Lakewood. They're set up as enterprise funds. That means they are funded through user rates and charges. So all the money that you send every month on your bills, that's what funds the operations and the investment in these capital projects. They're not funded from general fund tax revenue. So what that means is they have to operate sort of like mini businesses. The money that they generate is the money that they can spend on the system. So that's why, unfortunately, rates have been going up to fund that investment that we've made over the last 10 years. And when we look forward, we're going to be seeing those affordability challenges again as well, because that money has to come from the enterprise fund. We have to think long term. We obviously have big investments to make. We have to maintain the assets that we already have out in the ground providing service on a regular basis, and so we need to think on a 5, 10, 20, 30, 40-year time frame so we're not caught off guard. And obviously we have been doing that, have been trying to get ready for this kind of big bite we're taking. And some of the costs that we have, they're increasing faster than the rate of inflation. Healthcare, costs for chemicals, powers, the same kind of costs that are driving most of our household budgets up are affecting the utility. So all of this is at play as we're thinking about these things. A quick look back in time. So for most folks, sort of a typical residential bill in the city is about 6 CCF per month. That's about 4,500 gallons of water, and your wastewater bill is based on how much water you consume. That's pretty typical throughout the industry, but you can see, looking back since 2000, some pretty dramatic increases there. It's about 5.4% per year over that time. That's certainly a big amount, and I'm sure you all have felt that. It's actually a little less than what we've seen across the industry, across the country. Every city seemingly is facing these same challenges, and so the average national rate, we do a survey every other year, hundreds of utilities across the country, it's over 6% per year over the same time frame. But also keep in mind how we compare to our neighbors. Certainly, we want to make sure that we are competitive, that we're attracting residents to the city to promote the kind of vitality of the economy. And you can see that relative to a lot of our neighbors, that typical bill for 4,500 gallons a month is favorable. Lou mentioned, Cleveland Heights, they've got the Northeast Ohio Sewer District's consent decree. They've got their own consent decree, and you can see that clearly manifest in the amount that their customers would pay for the same amount of service that they get here. The challenge is, we don't want the $81 that a Lakewood customer pays to go up to the $142. So we don't want the EPA to use that as, well, if Cleveland Heights can pay it, so can you. So we need to be very careful about that. We need to be aware about that, and we want to understand your reactions and thoughts on, what is favorable? How do we want to compare to our neighbors? So how do we kind of measure affordability in terms of these hundreds of millions of dollar investments? That's a big number, and unless the city wins Powerball tonight, we can't afford that. Lou mentioned the 1997 Financial Capability Assessment. So that's this big framework. A lot of it doesn't make a whole lot of sense and doesn't provide a great way to measure that. But the one thing that comes out of it that most people will reference is this sense that a community would be high burdened, their customers would be high burdened if their wastewater bill or their share of the costs exceeds 2% of the community's median household income. So when half of your community, that's the median, so 50% of your community's income, if 2% of that is directed to the the wastewater bill for those compliance costs, that's considered a high burden. Right now, Lakewood is at 1.3%, sort of for that typical bill level. So we're not there yet, but when we look at some of these long-term costs, we'll see sort of how that changes pretty dramatically. The 2012 update to that gives us some leverage, and we'll be working with the team to kind of craft that message to make sure that it's clear. Affordability is a major concern, and we can look at a lot of unique local conditions to help make that argument here. So some of our income distribution information, unique demographic and economic characteristics of the city, we'll be using that to help us make our argument and to get a much longer time period to make these investments in our system. Some other things, instead of just 2% of the median that are being used, lots of new things are coming out in the industry. It's a very kind of hot topic, if you will. Folks are trying to figure out a better way to measure that. Some people look at the hours of minimum wage it takes to pay your water and sewer bill. There's other ratios that look at local housing costs and energy costs to come up with sort of an affordability ratio. So we'll be exploring all these things to strengthen our argument. So right now, the bill's $81.50. We saw it on the comparison. It takes about 10 hours of someone at minimum wage to pay that. The Ohio minimum wage is like $8.30. The person that came up with that, or over 8 hours is considered a lot. So we're already at that point. The original plan, the CSO only plan, which Lou mentioned, was sort of an incomplete plan, $274 million. That was in 2006 dollars. So when we inflate that to today's value of money, it's actually a $385 million investment. That's what that old plan was. Right now, as we've gone through the integrated process, we've changed that. We've actually lowered that number quite a bit. And there's a few things up there. You might be wondering why my math doesn't work, and there's a reason. So the first one is maintaining the existing assets. So we've got hundreds of miles of pipes out there. We've got treatment facilities. Most of that is really old. We need to spend money to take care of that, just like you would your house or your car. So there is a lot of money that we need to spend in these assets that are very old and falling apart. Over the next 15 or 20 years, the price tag just to take care of what we already have out there, if we did nothing else, it's around $150 million. If we don't spend that money, things fall apart, things break. There's sinkholes, there's water main breaks, so important. In addition to that, we've got the $25 million high-rate treatment facility that was just kind of awarded, which the mayor mentioned. And then beyond that, a lot of the projects that Julie and Mark were talking about, anywhere in the $200, $250 million of additional money in today's dollars. So that's why the bottom, the compliance-related only, would just be those bottom two numbers, 225, 275. So that is down from the 385 that it was. But still a very, very big number, especially considering, just the size of the city. There's some opportunities for synergies, for sure, yeah. If something breaks, I think we're going to fix it with a solution that would help achieve the other goals, certainly. But some of it is sort of taking care of just standard rehab of the water lines, which, they're quite old as well. So how does it look, looking forward? So if we do the high-rate treatment facility that's currently, kind of just about to start work, and we take care of the assets we have right now, in 15 years, about 3.7% of the annual median household income would go to pay both your water and sewer bills. So 2% would be sort of for one service, sewer. Kind of rule of thumb would be to double it, so 4% of median household income for both water and sewer service. So that 3.7% is below the combined kind of threshold that's out there. It is not a hard and fast rule, it's just sort of a guideline. So, community-wise, we might be okay, but even so, at least, 20,000 or so of the households in the city would be above that 4% metric because, 50% of the people are below the median, or 49, I guess. If we do all the other stuff, then we do cross that threshold for half of our community, and still, over that 20,000 households would be at risk, even more at risk, because rates would have had to go higher to pay for those things. So how can we pay this? How can we afford this? How can we fund this? Most of the systems were paid for with federal grant money. That money doesn't exist. There's not very much federal or state grant money out there to be had. So the city residents, city businesses, they're ultimately going to have to bear that cost and the responsibility to invest this money. But as the mayor mentioned, community economics are going to provide a very real limit to what we can spend and also how quickly we could spend that much money. So very much a big part of how we sequence and time these investments. And that affordability threshold is something we're going to be looking to y'all to help us define. Is it, a typical bill as a percent of income? Is it, how many residents might be at risk at a certain bill amount? There isn't, again, a hard and fast rule. So it's important to understand what the community feels is a responsible level, to ask customers to be able to pay to make these improvements, these investments in our critical systems. And then finally, how do we recover that revenue? So right now, your bill is based on how much water volume you use. Everything that shows up on your water and sewer bill is based on how much water goes through your meter. So if you use less, you would pay less. But that also means from the city's perspective, it's an unreliable source of revenue. So if you replace your washing machine with a high-efficiency washing machine, the city gets a little less money because you're using a little less water. But they still have to maintain all those pipes out in the system. They still have to do all this investment, but now they have less to kind of spread it over. And if you look back, a pretty dramatic graph there, that is the total amount of water consumption billed to our customers since 1998, a 30% reduction, over 30% reduction in that time period, 2% per year. So effectively what that means, if the city were to do a 5% rate increase, it actually only get 3% additional revenue. So, when we looked at those bills going up dramatically since 2000, revenue has definitely not followed the same trend because of this issue.
What do you attribute the 30% reduction to?
So there's a number of things, and this is definitely not a Lakewood-specific issue. This is across the industry, 2% per year since 1998 is exactly what we see everywhere. It's high-efficiency plumbing fixtures. It's changes to the plumbing code. It's high-efficiency appliances. Just a general sort of awareness of water conservation and trying to be better stewards of water resources.
And I would add lower density households. Fewer people in the household.
Yep. So it's a trend. It seems every other year we say it seems to be bottoming out. It seems to be leveling out. But it's been doing this not just here. There's maybe 3 or 4 communities that are super high growth that don't have this trend. Everyone is 1 or 2% per year reduction in consumption. So how do we kind of balance that? Most utilities. Oh, sorry.
Doesn't it help you with having lower sewage? Does it help you actually help your problem? Less water going into the system means there's less sanitary waste, right?
Our problem is rainwater.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
And the second is you're treating the sewer and water as a separate from the rest of the city. The city imposes a burden on the citizens in other ways. So it's not only just water, sewer, but it's also taxes, it's schools and such. There's a total kind of cost to live in the city of Lakewood.
Absolutely.
You're treating it as you're looking at just part of it. You're going to pull this all together, right?
In this
And you're going to help us do that.
Yep. Yeah, this presentation is definitely focused just on water and sewer, but our affordability argument is definitely encompasses the overall costs of just being here. Exactly. The school, everything. You're exactly right. So, yep.
What time period is being anticipated that all of these capital improvements will have to be completed within? Do you have any speculation on what that might be? 15 years, 20 years, 10 years?
15 to 100 years.
I like the 100-year part.
We do too.
And we're not giving up on that one bit. There's
Yeah,
certain processes, you know, that might be distributed over time, particularly at the household level maybe, that may occur as houses turn over, whatever mechanism we have. So we are not giving up on a 21st century plan.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering, I mean, what other instruments are you looking at? That's, I mean, clearly it's just not, you know, you're not going to be like, you know, paying your bill and then it's going to go to pay for a capital project. I mean, you're going to be selling bonds. Is this kind of what's anticipated? You know, so if there's 15 years, you'd have 15 years of bond payments. Are there any limitations on that we would have? And then also there's revolving loan funds, I know at the state level, that I don't know how much of that would be available, you know, to help fund something like this too. I think at low or zero interest.
And we take advantage of all of that.
Has that been figured into the calculation here? We're expecting like a 3 to 4% increase every year.
Yeah, for example, the high rate treatment is actually being funded almost 80% with those low interest loans from the Ohio Public Works Commission.
Okay.
I have a question too.
But you still have to pay them back. Yeah.
Your 20,000 household number that would be cost burdened by the improvements. Lakewood has a lot of rental property. Is that 20,000 based on the occupant of the household and their income, or the owner of the house
That's the occupant. So it's based on census data, and it's basically whoever's responding to the census survey. So it would be whoever's living there. And certainly an imperfect science, but to get to that 20,000 number, but that's what it theoretically represents. So we need to consider ways to kind of reverse the trend of this consumption. So we will want to talk and get your reactions to alternative ways to recover that revenue through a monthly fixed charge of $3 per month in addition to, or to replace part of that volumetric charge, so that, you know, the city can rely on that to help pay back the bonds that we know we've got to pay back when we're going to borrow all this money. The sewer district has a very extensive impervious area charge. It's based on, you know, how big rooftops and parking lots. And so, you know, a lot of the problem is driven by rainwater. The rainwater gets in the system because of all the impervious surfaces, you know, big parking lots, big, you know, warehouses. They may not use much water, but they cause a lot of runoff, excuse me. So is that something we ought to explore to help recover that revenue more equitably? The stormwater rate, or, you know, are there other things that you may think of, other levies or taxes, that would be a better way, an easier way for customers to kind of, you know, recover this cost? So those are things we'll be looking to get your reactions to in November and December. Anything else, any other questions? Or
You are masters of the subject. We're meeting again in November, the 15th, right? Lakewood Women's Pavilion, roundtable discussion. All these points are going to be at the tabletop level. I'm sure you've got a lot of questions. You probably have a lot of thoughts, a lot of concerns. Those are very important. Questions, what are they? Because if you have them, so does probably thousands of other people in our community. Concerns, you have them, thousands of people have them. Creative ideas, you might be the only one with the breakthrough idea. But the point is, we need to hear it all. So the question to you tonight is, what can we do between now and November 15th to help that session be productive? What information is still very murky that we need to sharpen up on? What background? We're going to put these presentations on our website. It'll be one of the banners at the top, so you'll get to it probably by tomorrow. It'll be there. And we're going to create a capacity for you to provide feedback on the website as well, so that we can collect your information there. So what grabs you? By the way, I do want to recognize Mike Foley, Director of Sustainability for Cuyahoga County. Mike, thanks for being in Lakewood tonight. Hey, Mike's our man. Yeah. Yeah, Ruth Ann?
So the chart that showed the various interventions and the costs, so do you have a companion chart that shows the benefits of the different interventions to compare?
That's a great question. That's a perfect question, because that's the complexity of it. Mark, you want to comment, or?
So as we've worked to develop a model that represents the conditions now, when we start building improvements into that model, it allows us to understand what the benefits are of each of those projects. And that's really where we're at now. We have the alternatives on the table for the most part. We continue to refine them and add to them. But this next part is getting additional feedback from everyone here and pushing down that road a little further so that we start to pull those pieces into the puzzle and look at the results on an outfall by outfall basis. And then understand, okay, if we do all of these different alternatives, pull in these different pieces, how much is it going to cost? And it goes into a loop then, with everyone in terms of what can we afford and what is the most appropriate solution for the city. And Mayor, I don't know if you want to speak to, the fact that we want to be, that's the point of this meeting, we want to be in the driver's seat for creating that answer. We don't want EPA to be the one to tell it to us. We want to understand for ourselves what the best answer is and show them that we know what we're talking about.
For example, source control pilot project. What are we, 3 years of digging in your neighborhood, Mike? Gets a little wearisome, I suppose? Yeah, right. Right, so the point is, disruption, inconvenience is a factor in a tight neighborhood like we have. It may be the cheapest, maybe the best value, but it may be the longest to achieve, and it may be the most disruptive. How do we triangulate those numbers? Cheapest, best value, most disruptive, longest. The EPA, the question was, how long do we have? The EPA has a very different view of longest than we have. So those are the pieces. If we affirm that we really believe that the best value and the disruption is tolerable, but we need lots of time, that would be a key point for us to understand from our community. Does that make sense? Well, that was one of the checkpoints, for example, source control of one of them. But there is information upon each of those outflows might have multiple engineering components. And what I would expect we'll do next week is you'll take one of them and you'll work through all those options to give you the flavor behind that chart.
So to give an example, maybe I can answer your question better.
Well, wait, I think you wanted to clarify your question, maybe. Then we'll answer.
I had another question.
Okay.
Okay, so take a portion of the city, take one of those sewer sheds. If we're going to attempt to do source control in that sewer shed, we'll model source control on those 20 streets that contribute to that one outfall. If in addition to the source control, after we run our model, we see, we're still having more overflows from this sewer shed than the regulators will allow, we'll also include additional alternatives. And whatever that compilation of alternatives is, there's an answer in terms of pollutant reduction. So to answer your question, when we build a model and we've built different scenarios, the model gives us an answer in terms of what the reduction to the pollutant load at that outfall is.
All right. Okay. What other questions, thoughts?
It's a simple one. How you doing?
Mr. Fesco, right?
Yeah. So
thanks for being here tonight. Retired Eaton environmental engineer, lives on Chase, so brain gain for us. Thanks for being here tonight.
So the simple question is where are we going in the grand sense of things? Because there's so many moving parts. You're talking about people paying money. You're talking about all of these watersheds. But how do you know when you're good and when you've got there? Unless you've got a place that you're going to be eventually, you could spend a lot of time digging up people's front yards and never really result in any good results. So do we know where we want to be in 5, 10, and 20 years?
Where we want to be is to continue to demonstrate progress towards compliance. So we're at 88%. We've worked hard to get there. We're at 80% of every drop of water that comes into Lakewood, rain or otherwise, we collect 88% of that and treat it. We know that the EPA says that has to be higher. They're thinking 100. We're thinking, let's get to 93. Let's figure out how we can get to 93 with our affordability challenges and our engineering. And what we're seeking is time and we're seeking flexibility. That's what we're seeking. So we can't be confident today that we're going to raise $300 million, we're going to spend $300 million, and we're going to say, touchdown victory, we're at 100%. We don't think that's a realistic option for us. Even if we had the $300 million, we're not so sure the engineering's that perfect. So we need to continue to make progress and demonstrate that within our pocketbook. So that's what we define as success. And that runs flat into a collision with the EPA and the Department of Justice of the United States of America, which says we want this tidied up in 20 years. And so that's the collision. So 2019 will be really that collision and how we negotiate it. I'm not trying to avoid it, but the answer is it's not tidy. The answer is not tidy. Yes.
To build off that question there, so in the study we've done, have we taken a look at for each additional percentage gain, what the potential dollar spend is? So we
Yes.
kind of find that sweet spot of what's realistic, and after 92, 93%, it just is financially unfeasible at that point?
And there is diminishing returns for these investments. Some of these, we could spend $70 million and get another 3%. Towards the end, we spend $70 million and we pick up 0.5%. And so that's part of the drama of what makes sense for our community. Justin and I visit our U.S. senators and our U.S. congressmen. We meet with their staffs. And fortunately, these are Ohio folks, Portman, Brown, and Capter. They understand, at least some of them do, we could spend $270 million, and that's not going to solve one of the big problems, which is agricultural runoff in the Maumee River Valley. And so if we even became pure, it's not going to clean up the western basin of Lake Erie, which is the big problem we have in the Great Lakes. And so if you were to divert $100 million from us to them, it would probably be 10 times the impact, but we don't have that luxury. So that's part of the drama.
Are we also comparing ourselves, 1% of discharge compared to a 1% discharge at the district, and how does that scale? Our scale is probably much different than some of the other scale.
Yeah. So that's a great question. By the way, one of our resources is Andy Lucas, who's with Brown and Caldwell. Andy, why don't you come forward if you would? These are the kinds of questions that are played out nationally. One of the points we make is, why is Lakewood dealing with this 1972 law in 2018? And the answer is, it's our turn. Columbus, Cincinnati, Toledo, Youngstown, parts east of us, the sewer district, they worked through, and I'll take that writ large across the country, all these cities, Chicago, Milwaukee, et cetera. And Andy's been part of these big conversations. So I think the question is how we compare our investments and diminishment versus the regional and national. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so you aren't unique from the standpoint of having to deal with this issue, and we recognize these are expensive, they're long-term programs. Your kids, your grandkids may end up, having to pay for these things down the road. So they need to be thought through really well. Looking at things like cost efficiency is really important. I come from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who did their big investments many years ago. They kind of finished up their program in the early 90s, and now they're at a point of seeing how it's performing over the long haul, and it's done very well. So these things can be successfully contemplated, constructed, and operated. I think a question came up before, like, who else has done a plan like this, kind of an integrated plan? We did a plan for the city of Seattle, Seattle Public Utilities. It was part of a consent decree that they had. And they wanted to know what was the best investment for them. Was it spending on stormwater control or spending on further CSO control? They were already at a point where they were having CSOs. Their state obligation was to get down to 1 per year, CSOs from all their discharges. And they went, gosh, we could, I guess, do that, but we've got these higher priority stormwater projects we'd like to do that'll have a lot bigger bang for the buck. So they got agreement with the federal government, with the state of Washington, to look at things on a spend this money for pounds removal of different pollutants, and they were able to reorder the projects. They didn't, eliminate their obligation from spending on these less productive CSO control projects, but they were able to stretch out in time when they would actually do those improvements. and spend the money up front on what really mattered the most, and that was cutting down on suspended solids and other contaminants to the local waterways. And that's the kind of way that we would like to structure this plan for you, is to come up with something that's really going to have the biggest bang for the buck in the proper order.
How do you answer the question of, when are we done? What was it? When are we done? How do we leave Milwaukee?
How do you be Milwaukee?
Milwaukee's not done.
Milwaukee may not be done either. You know, they're looking at a long-term green infrastructure program. You know, their citizens are expecting even higher level of performance than the government is. I don't think the government's going to push them much further, but their citizens want to see fewer overflows, and so they're looking at a GI program to soak up more water before it hits the system. So that's one of the things they're doing. Yeah, I think the financial burden is a really important part of this, and kind of helps set a course for you know, what you can afford to spend without it really being a problem for the citizens. And it becomes a nuanced negotiation with the state and federal regulators of, hey, let's not, you know, try to bite too big of the apple here. Let's do a measured biting of this apple over time and eventually get to that point. The question about, you know, looking at percent gain for different improvements is a really good way of looking at it. Some of these overflows, they might want to stop maybe in events that happen every other year, or once every 5 years, or once every 10 years. When you take a look at how much additional pollutant gets taken out, you know, how much less pollutant gets discharged in those events, it's really not that much, because those events are really infrequent. They drop a lot of rain, but you know, the system takes up a lot of it. And so the amount of pollutant that washes off is really not that much. But you could be talking about spending, you know, tens, you know, 20s, 30s, 50s millions of dollars to size for these larger facilities that really won't see much of a benefit to the waterway. And so we want to make sure that we've got a really good argument to justify for more affordable levels of control for Lakewood.
Mayor, I think I can, both Nick and Steve's question, one construct that I think is very useful to keep in mind is we only want to make the next best investments for a foreseeable future. So we do not want to be entangled in some commitment that we don't know if we're going to get to there on a whole series of projects. A lot of places have phased. Cincinnati, we negotiated a phased approach where they only do 10 years of work at a time. So what we're going to look for you on November 15th is, as we look at a whole plan, which we are required to put forward, what is the priority of what you would want to do in the next 10 years? And that comes to your question, Nick. Is it frequency of overflow? Is it percentage of pollutants going into Lake Erie, and what impact do they have versus pounds of pollutants going into Rocky River, and what do they have? What impact does that have? What's the best bang for the buck for a foreseeable future, so we maintain that flexibility and stay within our spending?
So maybe the answer to the question will have to be answered by you. What do we call success? Yeah.
Something
I know
that,
the hour is a little late.
We got a couple questions.
real quick question, I hope. Something that would be useful to know is if you know from the pilot project or otherwise, what percentage of the stormwater is coming from people's homes, private property, versus the streets. I will say that our city is in need of some way to water plants, like rain barrels would be useful. I don't know if that's a silly response, because I don't know what is the percentage. Do you know?
And that's green. Rain barrels are a great example of green infrastructure, and they slow things down. But only if you remember to empty your rain barrel before the next storm. It's like that tunnel.
I think one way to maybe take a stab at answering that, I can't give you an exact percentage, and maybe we could get out of the model, but think about the impervious area of the city. And if you think about any one of those sewer sheds, the average imperviousness is probably somewhere between 60 and 70%. That remaining 30 to 40% being green space in some capacity that would maybe have some infiltration. So if you assume that 60% of the total surface is impervious, and then you think about the portion that makes up roadways versus the portion on private property, which is rooftops and driveways. It's probably about split again. So, maybe 30% is private property, rooftops and driveways, runoff, and 30% is street, public right-of-way runoff. That would get you at least close, I think.
So tonight, was there a portion where we underdid it, overdid it? I mean, there's a lot to this, we know. So you want to think about it. And let's get some feedback then on the 15th. Yes?
I was just wondering if any of the preliminary engineering and financial studies, longer ones, will be available to us.
Yeah, behind every point tonight is a treasure trove of analysis. Director Pay, working with Raftelis, has a model, a financial model, that basically bakes in all these projects and goes out to what, 100 years? Yeah, so it's a fabulously complex Excel model. We can look at it. We can put a number in 10 years from now and see what the impact of that is. It gets to the issues of debt, availability of debt, rates, all those components of how we finance this. The model actually handles all that. So what we have to decide is what are the inputs to the model we want, and we make the calculations, and we'll see pretty clearly. But I would say it's pretty obvious to me that we're in serious affordability challenges 10 years from now. I mean, we really I will be in a position as your mayor to tell the regulators, and by the way, Justin and I are working hard to position our 2 senators and our congressperson to be our allies on this, about you can't ruin a town like Lakewood. That whatever burden you want to place on us for whatever good goal you have, that we might even agree to, there are limitations, and we have other factors and contributions to this region that have to be considered. That'll be a frontal attack against an entrenched enemy if we go down that road with the regulators' view and their obligations. But that we may get to that point. And when I get to that point, I want to know that you agree with me. If I speak on behalf of 52,000 people and their pocketbooks and their quality of life, I got to be able to mean it. So part of the feedback from the future is to affirm these limitations of what's common sense and what's possible. And so I hope that gives you a sense of the parameters here. This is serious stuff. There was another question, perhaps? All right. Well, this material is going to be on the website. We're going to be communicating to you. Oh, did you have a question? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking in terms of, and maybe this is part of the modeling, has there been an analysis done on the lifespan of the current infrastructure in taking into consideration what to prioritize so that the projects are kind of staggered so that the financial impact can be mitigated over time?
Well, and the answer is yes, but it can be improved. Part of our obligation is to do a better job as a city of managing the underground assets. We're actually in the process of identifying and implementing a better tool, a piece of software that will allow us to track that performance and the maintenance more effectively on a holistic basis. Because we're not just also talking about sewer pipes here. We're talking about 300 pieces of mobile equipment that we buy and sell and use all day long. We're talking about parks and the maintenance. There's a lot of other factors that go into our asset responsibilities. This happens to be a big one, but it's not the only one. And so we'll be doing a better job than we are today, but we have a good sense of it, but we can do better on that. And that will be part of our, I think, part of our plan as well. And we'll have to make that case. Yeah.
One thing to add, Mayor, that was a part of our financial model does include kind of that ongoing rehabilitation and replacement of our existing assets. We did a very comprehensive analysis of that with the help of Brown and Caldwell, some of their folks here in Cleveland who looked at kind of all the assets we currently have, what their useful life is, how old they are, what condition they're in, based on sort of age, and said, okay, we built out a 30-year plan of we need to start putting this money in. We can't get to full speed in year one, but so let's slowly build into taking care of these assets. So that is a part of all those financial numbers that I showed and that we will be sharing over the next few weeks and months.
And I would say we saw some numbers about Cleveland Heights. They did not maintain their system for a period of time, and they're paying for it now. We don't want to be in that position. Mike, last question. Financially, Director Pay, did you hear the question? From a financial standpoint, it's
Right.
probably been
Yes, from a
depreciated.
financial standpoint, in our, when we do our audit and put together our comprehensive annual financial report, all of the assets, which include the sewer system, water system, wastewater treatment plant, those are done on a depreciable basis. So when improvements are made, that is adjusted in the system. So, you know, if, right. So, right, so, but we do, and that's what is important with the comprehensive annual financial report, is you basically take municipal finance and try to make it and put it into a way to show it how you would in a business sense.
But if those are the kinds of questions that are important for us to be able to answer more effectively, we want to know that. So we'll be working hard when we meet on the 15th in small groups to try and get this clarified and get your input. So let's adjourn tonight. Grab a piece of pizza on your way out the door. And we're delighted that you're on the team. Thanks.